close your eyes and imagine drifting across the surface of the Mediterranean on a night so still you can no longer tell where the ocean's breath ends and your own begins. The water is flat like a deep blue mirror, calm in a way that feels impossible, as if something beneath it is holding its silence, guarding a story left unfinished for thousands of years. Far below that quiet surface, in a place untouched by moonlight, there once stood a brilliant port city at the gateway to ancient Egypt. People of the past knew it by two names, Tectonic and Heracleion. From the 12th to the 8th century before the Common Era, every ship coming in from the Mediterranean had to pass through this very spot before reaching the fertile delta of the Nile. It was the first maritime gate, the strict customs post, the place where Greek merchants first encountered the authority of the pharaoh, not through rumor, but through direct experience. And then, strangely, the very city that controlled trade, ritual, and the flow of goods simply vanished. No ruins left on the shore, no trace on any map. It slipped away so completely, it seemed to survive only in a few fading lines of ancient texts. Today, Heracleion lies buried under nearly 7 meters of seabed silt, about 2.5 kilometers off the coast. Colossal statues rising more than 5 meters tall. Stone stelae inscribed with the decrees of King Nectanebo I in the year 380 before the Common Era, the foundations of temples and the piers that once shaped daily life. All of them still rest there, perfectly preserved in the dim underwater light. They were not destroyed. They were not shattered. They simply fell asleep, waiting for the day when light would return. The disappearance of Heracleion was not a single violent moment. It crept in quietly, through subtle tremors in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the Common Era, through the slow exhaustion of young delta soil, through rising water that inched higher, decade after decade. A city that once stood balanced between river and sea was eventually swallowed by the very forces it had lived beside. Then came the year 2000, when Frank Gaudio and his archaeological team brushed away the first layers of sediment and touched the sunken stones. It was as if Heracleion opened its eyes after 2,000 years of rest. There was no roar of discovery, no dramatic unveiling, only a deep stillness, strangely similar to the moment it disappeared. Gentle, quiet, and filled with the sense that this city had never truly left human memory. It had simply been waiting in another layer of time. Now, when you look down at the dark surface of the sea, you might feel it too. The sense that Heracleion is still there, not lost, only shifted into the shadows of the water. The ocean did not erase it. The ocean kept it safe, and so our journey begins here, on this calm and silent surface, where a single question rises like a slow tide. What was Heracleion before it became the city asleep beneath the sea? Let historical storytell take you deeper into the first chapter of the story. Imagine the ancient Nile Delta as a living map, a place where river branches spread out like green veins, and the northern landscape shifted constantly with every flood season. Somewhere along that changing frontier, between the 12th and 8th century before the Common Era, stood a city at a spot that today is nothing more than open water leading into the Mediterranean. It carried two names, Tectonic to the Egyptians and Heracleion to the Greeks. It was not simply a coastal settlement. It was Egypt's first maritime gateway, the place every foreign ship was required to stop before gaining access to the sacred river that guided travelers into the heartland. Here, merchants declared their goods, paid their taxes, and presented themselves before officials serving the pharaoh. Anyone who wished to reach Egypt's interior had to pass through this checkpoint. No exceptions, no alternate routes. Heracleion's location was a rare harmony between nature and human choice. The Nile Delta was always in motion, building up new land, swallowing old sandbanks, reshaping its channels. Yet the Canopic Inlet held a naturally deep passage, protected and calm enough for large ships to anchor without fighting the elements. Trade in that era needed more than skill. It needed a place like this, where sea and river met on their own terms. From this advantage, Heracleion blossomed, as if raised by both the Nile and the Mediterranean working together. Archaeological reconstructions show a city built on interconnected islands, laced with a dense network of canals. In that sense, Heracleion carried the early spirit of a watery Venice, yet kept the unmistakable character of ancient Egypt, where life revolved around the flow of water. When ships from Greece, Phoenicia, or Cyrene crossed the sea and approached the harbor, the first thing they saw was a long corridor of quays, towering warehouses pressed against the edges of the canals, and stone monuments rising with the silent authority of a city governed by the pharaoh's order. By the 22nd dynasty, around the 10th century before the Common Era, Heracleion had become the dominant commercial control point of the northern region. No vessel entered Egypt without passing through it. Seals, pottery fragments, and traces of foreign dwellings found underwater show that outsiders, especially Greek merchants, stayed long enough to form small communities that existed side by side with native Egyptians. The two names, Thanis and Heracleion, did not coexist only in texts. They shaped the rhythm of the city itself. Thanis carried the weight of the pharaoh and the sacred duties of the Temple of Amun. Heracleion echoed the Greek hero Heracles, whom travelers believed had once journeyed through Egypt. Because of this dual identity, the city pulsed with a unique energy, solemn and ceremonial in the Egyptian way, yet lively like the great ports of the Mediterranean. Greek sources often described Heracleion as the gateway that cannot be bypassed. Goods exchanged here were more than objects. They brought languages, beliefs, and political influence into contact. This was the place where two civilizations met, not through conflict, but through the natural currents of commerce and curiosity. Yet beneath all that prosperity lay a fragile foundation. Massive stone structures weighing dozens of tons sat directly on young, unstable delta silt. The harbors kept expanding, temples grew heavier, and the Nile continued to shift its course according to laws humans could not command. The quiet persistence of nature, slow, subtle, but relentless, began shaping the city's fate. Heracleion existed in a delicate balance, thriving yet vulnerable, powerful yet built on soft ground, shining like a lantern set upon the surface of water. Brilliant, but always one change away from losing its footing. And from that delicate rhythm, between statues, canals, and sacred temples, we step into the next chapter. The spiritual heart of Heracleion, where power and divinity intertwined long before the sea carried the city into its silent depth. When Heracleion entered its most stable era, roughly the 7th to the 5th century before the Common Era, the city seemed to settle into its own heartbeat. Its structures emerged, like the final strokes of an old painting coming into focus. Every stone platform, every strip of land, every canal carried the feeling of being placed there, not just for function, but to hold the spirit of the place itself. Underwater surveys reveal that Heracleion was far more than a bustling port. Its layout, expansive, symmetrical, solemn, suggests a ceremonial center for the entire delta. Along the entrance to the great temple of Amun once stood colossal statues carved from Aswan red granite, each more than 5 meters tall and weighing tens of tons. They rose like silent guardians, watching over Egypt's maritime gate. Morning light would strike their faces and cast long shadows across the water, giving travelers the impression that unseen gods were observing their arrival. What makes these statues even more astonishing is the foundation beneath them. They stood not on solid bedrock, but on young delta silt reinforced with wooden piles, a technique both ingenious and daring in a land constantly shifting with the pulse of the river. And yet, for centuries, these massive figures remained upright, reflected on the surface of the canals like markers of the pharaoh's unwavering authority. At the city's spiritual center stood the temple of Amun Khonsu, built during the 26th dynasty, around the 6th century before the Common Era. The temple played a central role in the Divine Water Festival, a sacred multi-day ritual reinforcing the connection between the pharaoh and Amun of Thebes. Stone stelae recovered from the seabed describe ceremonial boats gliding through Heracleion's canals as part of this elaborate procession. The city was clearly designed for dual purposes: commerce and ritual, earthly life and divine presence woven tightly together. Archaeologists have reconstructed that ceremonial journey. Beginning at the main temple, the illuminated ritual boat would drift slowly through the wide canals, circling the city before returning to its starting point. In the days when Heracleion thrived, the scent of incense, the beat of drums, and the chants of priests likely echoed between reed-lined banks and stone quays, the water shimmering with torchlight stirred by the sea breeze. During festival nights, the city must have looked like a floating constellation, but Heracleion also spoke through law, not just devotion. One of the strongest pieces of evidence is the decree stela of King Nectanebo I, carved in 380 before the Common Era. Nearly 2 meters tall and astonishingly intact, when discovered in 2000, it declares that all foreign goods entering Egypt must pay customs duties at Heracleion before proceeding inland. This turned the city into Egypt's economic shield in the north, the place where pharaonic power confronted the outside world. As the archaeological fragments come together, we see that Heracleion lived with two intertwined souls, one facing the gods, anchored in the temple of Amun, and the rituals that linked royalty to the divine. Another facing the sea, where warehouses, docks, and foreign ships built a restless, international pulse. The city was therefore both a ceremonial threshold for the gods and a bureaucratic doorway for the world beyond Egypt. Its beauty came from the harmony between formality and spontaneity, between monumental stone structures and soft, curving waterways shaped by the natural shoreline. Heracleion was not built on a grid. It grew to the rhythm of the water surrounding it. Looking at reconstructed maps, it's easy to imagine ancient residents paddling light boats through a web of channels, moving from sanctuaries to living quarters, from warehouse districts to floating markets, from priestly residences to Greek merchant enclaves. Every bend in a canal revealed another piece of the city's character, orderly yet fluid, sacred yet rooted in daily life. And when the colossal statues were found underwater, still wearing the same calm expressions, we understand something essential. Heracleion was a place where people lived in two worlds at once, the world of work and the world of ceremony, flowing one beneath the other like layered sediment, preserved through time. This very duality opens the door to the next chapter. Heracleion was not only where Egypt enforced its power, but the first point where Egypt met the Greek world, a meeting that would reshape both. Now, let us move forward to the next part, the invisible currents of trade that turned Heracleion into a heartbeat of the Mediterranean. When Heracleion reached its height between the 6th and 4th century before the Common Era, the city seemed to move to a different rhythm, no longer driven solely by the echo of Amun-Khonsu's rituals, but by the steady beat of ships arriving from across the Mediterranean. Heracleion became the very first bridge between Egypt and the Greek world, not through treaties or scribes, but through white sails drifting into the river mouth like punctuation marks on the map of history. The Greek amphorae found beneath the seabed tell that story more clearly than any written chronicle. Wine from Chios, olive oil from Rhodes, honey from Attica, all flowed through Heracleion as if they were the lifeblood of Mediterranean commerce. In return, Egypt sent out wheat, papyrus, and linen, the resources that had made the Nile Valley a foundation of the ancient world. But the goods themselves were only the surface. What made Heracleion unique was the requirement, carved into the decree of Nectanebo I, that every foreign ship stop here before entering Egypt's interior. The city functioned as a gate of control, a place where the pharaoh placed his hand directly on the current of international trade. Every journey into Egypt was obliged to acknowledge Egyptian authority, and when those ships paused, they left their traces behind. Greek inscriptions carved into stone, merchant seals marking ownership, and small clusters of foreign dwellings near the waterfront. Greek merchants lived in Heracleion in a curious in-between state, half guests, half residents, forming a cultural threshold unlike anything Egypt had seen before Naucratis was founded. The scene must have been extraordinary. Egyptian guards standing beside sailors from Aegina, the prayers to Amun drifting across the water, while Greek voices carried along the docks. Temples and rows of amphorae reflected together in the canals. This was not just a place where Greece traded with Egypt. It was where Greece first touched the spiritual and political world of Egypt. The exchange even seeped into ritual life. Some Greek merchants witnessed, and perhaps participated in, ceremonies honoring Amun. From fragments of these experiences, the Hellenization of Amun, and eventually the birth of Serapis, may have begun. If Naucratis later became the Greek settlement, Heracleion was where the Greeks first learned how to interpret Egypt. Tiny lead seals recovered from the seabed testify to the complexity of this administrative system. They were the punctuation marks of international commerce, each seal representing a decision, a shipment, a moment when the pharaoh approved the movement of goods into his land. And among all the objects resting underwater, coins, amphorae, seals, stelae, one can still hear the rhythm of the ancient harbor, the tap of boats nudging one another, the scrape of wood against stone, the mingled scent of salt, wine, and incense. Heracleion grew through its openness to the world, but that same openness tied its fate to the water. The more a city belongs to the sea, the more vulnerable it becomes to even the smallest shifting of the tide. If trade made Heracleion the gateway of Egypt, then ritual transformed it into a place where gods and humans could walk together on the same surface of water. From the 7th to the 4th century before the Common Era, this city was not just a stopping point for merchants. It was the stage for sacred ceremonies so significant that even the sea and sky seemed to pause and watch. At the heart of that spiritual life stood the temple of Amun-Khonsu, built during the 26th dynasty. It was here that the Great Divine Water Festival began, one of the most important rituals of the Delta. During the ceremony, a wooden statue of Amun, carved from precious timber, was placed on a covered ritual boat, a sacred bark, and carried along Heracleion's canals. In the days when the city still rose above the waves, torchlight from the procession would strike the gold on the priests' headdresses, making the surface of the water glow as if it were breathing beneath a layer of holy fire. For the Egyptians, this was far more than a religious event. It was a declaration of royal authority, a yearly affirmation that Amun did not dwell only in distant Thebes, but visited the Delta to renew the pharaoh's divine legitimacy. Many scholars believe the festival was also tied to the Nile's flood cycle, the moment when life returned to the land. That connection made Heracleion's waters a symbol of rebirth, a place where the world was renewed with every ritual passage. The colossal statues, nearly 5 meters tall, later rescued from the seabed, once stood in a grand row along the approach to the temple like motionless sentinels. Statues of kings, queens, and gods were aligned on an axis leading directly from the harbor to the inner sanctuary. At certain moments of the day, the sun struck their faces at just the right angle, a design too precise to be coincidence. It was the Egyptian way of letting nature participate in worship, allowing sunlight itself to become part of the prayer. Stone stelae recovered from the deep describe these brilliant ceremonies. Priests with torches walking in procession, drums echoing in steady rhythm, reed pipes playing their rough, haunting notes as the season of the Nile approached. The descriptions match perfectly with archaeological finds. Fragments of jewelry lost in the water, decayed pieces of ritual boats, small votive statues used in processions. They lie silent now beneath the mud, yet their shapes remain so clear it feels as if the ceremony ended only yesterday. Heracleion, then, was not merely a city that lived by trade. It was a place where people believed they could borrow the surface of the water to speak to the sky. When the ritual bark glided past, residents likely gathered along the canals, watching stars reflect on the water as the god's boat drifted by like a fragment of another world visiting their own. Here, the sea was not just a trade route. It was a witness to the city's most sacred moments. But beneath the splendor of these ceremonies lay a quiet paradox. The structures built to honor the gods, statues weighing tens of tons, towering temple walls, massive stone pillars, all added weight to the soft delta soil beneath them. Heracleion placed divine grandeur on land that never stopped shifting. Even in its prosperous days, faint tremors underfoot, the slight cracking of temple walls during the flood season, or the subtle movement of mud below may have been early warnings that something was beginning to change. The people of Heracleion could not have fully understood those sounds. But from an archaeological view today, they were the first whispers of danger. signals that the city was drifting toward a fragile boundary between prosperity and the unstoppable forces of nature. And from this world of ritual, we move into the next truth. Heracleon's greatest age of prosperity was approaching, and that prosperity would place the city in more danger than ever before. By the 6th to 4th century before the Common Era, Heracleion entered the brightest chapter of its existence, a period when prosperity rose not from walls or warriors, but from the constant arrival of ships, each one beating like a pulse against the edge of the sea. The city lived through movement, through the tides that carried goods and stories from every corner of the Mediterranean. Underwater excavations reveal layered stacks of amphorae buried in silt, evidence that Heracleion was once an irreplaceable stop along major maritime routes. The scents of wine, olive oil, grain, and resin must have drifted through its canals, faint traces of a wider world passing through the city each day. Yet for all its traffic and wealth, Heracleion never tried to confine itself within the rigid geometry of an inland city. It bent with its canals, opened with the river branches, adapted to the sea's quiet changes, a settlement shaped more like water than stone, listening, adjusting, flowing. But that very flexibility carried a deep vulnerability. The young delta soil shifted a little every year, sea levels crept upward, and the Nile continued its ancient habit of altering its course. The city existed in a delicate balance, where human life and natural forces had to move in step with one another. As small shifts accumulated, subtle subsidence, eroded banks, tiny cracks no one noticed, Heracleion continued to flourish, unaware that these quiet patterns were laying the foundation for a very different chapter in its story. And from those almost invisible changes, the narrative began to drift away from the light, carrying the city toward a fate no one of its time could have imagined. A slow descent into the sea that once sustained it and would one day take it back. Heracleion's prosperity carried within it a quiet paradox. The entire heartbeat of the city rested on the most fragile foundation in the Nile Delta: young, soft, ever-shifting alluvial soil. When geologists studied the area in the late 20th century, they discovered that Heracleion had never stood on solid bedrock. Instead, it was built on a landscape still being formed, a world of water, mud, and sand that never truly stilled. No matter how sophisticated the architecture, the city rose upon a surface that breathed. Archaeology shows that signs of subsidence appeared early, possibly as far back as the 5th century before the Common Era. Each flood season brought a new layer of silt, subtly changing the depth of the canals. Wooden piles found beneath the seabed reveal a constant struggle. The residents had to reinforce the embankments again and again. In some areas, they rebuilt them 2 or even 3 times in a single century. They recognized the danger, but could only slow it, never fully stop it. Beneath Heracleion lay alternating layers of river silt and marine sand, creating a foundation vulnerable to a phenomenon known today as liquefaction, the moment when soil loses its firmness, turning into something like dense slurry, no longer able to support heavy structures. A massive statue, a temple corner, even an entire waterfront platform could begin to tilt or sink gradually into the earth. It is no surprise, then, that by the 3rd century before the Common Era, buildings near the waterline began to drift slightly off alignment. Sections of walls showed fine cracks. Rows of wooden piles decayed faster than expected. Steps leading into the canals tilted to one side. All these details spoke the same truth. Heracleion existed on land that never stopped moving, stretching, and settling under the shifts of the Nile and the motion of the sea. Meanwhile, the Nile's constant reshaping added a second challenge. As the main channel shifted course every few decades, silt accumulated unevenly, causing harbors to grow shallow. Some years, strong floods eroded sections of the embankments, exposing older construction beneath. Residents were forced to dredge canals, drive new piles, and carve out fresh waterways. A relentless cycle, as if the city had to remake itself again and again, simply to stay alive. Archaeologists often ask, why would the Egyptians build such a crucial city on unstable ground? The answer lies in Heracleion's strategic position. It stood at the entrance of the Canopic branch, the shortest, most direct route from the sea into the heart of Egypt. It was where foreign ships were required to stop, where Amun's water rituals were performed, where economic and spiritual interests converged. The Egyptians knew the risks, but the value of the location outweighed any hesitation. Yet by the 2nd century before the Common Era, the pace of subsidence increased. Entire sections of the waterfront became unusable, forcing inhabitants to retreat farther inland. Evidence shows more frequent attempts to raise foundations, relocate docks, and reinforce platforms with larger stone blocks. The people of Heracleion had skill. They simply faced a natural force no ancient civilization could overcome. And through all of this, the rituals at the Temple of Amun continued without interruption. This reveals something deeply human, the ancient belief that sacred order could endure even when the ground beneath one's feet whispered the opposite. Residents still paddled through the canals, still lit torches as the ritual bark passed, still watched the blue shimmer of water climb the stone faces of divine statues, as if ceremony could anchor the city in place. But the history of port cities follows a rule that offers no mercy. When the ground begins to falter, it takes only one powerful force to change everything. For Heracleion, that force arrived as the strong earthquakes of the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the Common Era. Tremors we will meet in the next part, where the soft warnings of instability become undeniable reality, pulling the city downward from the world of sunlight into the depths below. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the Common Era, Heracleion was standing on ground that had reached the end of its strength. Centuries of subsidence, shifting sediments, and tireless attempts to reinforce the city had slowed nature's process, but never reversed it. And then came what no resident could ever truly prepare for: violent tremors rising from deep within the earth, quiet in sound, decisive in force, pushing Heracleion toward the moment written in its fate. The Eastern Mediterranean has always been restless with geological fault lines. That is true today, and it was even more true between the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the Common Era. Accounts from Greco-Roman historians, combined with modern seismic analysis, show that this region endured a series of moderate to major earthquakes between the years 150 and 270. For a city built on young alluvial soil, every tremor was not just vibration, it was a trigger. A mechanism beneath the ground stirred, and liquefaction began. The one phenomenon Heracleion could not resist. The archaeological layers reveal a haunting picture. Temple walls did not crumble into pieces. They leaned, entire sections tilting as if the ground beneath them had been pulled away in an instant. Colossal statues, nearly 5 meters tall, did not shatter. They slid gently, almost gracefully, and lay on their sides as if pushed by an invisible hand. For a stone figure weighing tens of tons to move intact, only one explanation fits. The soil beneath them had lost its strength, turning into a thick slurry within seconds of a strong tremor. Sediment samples reinforce this with unsettling clarity. Layers of marine mud are churned in patterns identical to modern liquefaction models. Stones and bricks lie jumbled in a chaotic structure that only sudden loss of soil rigidity can produce. This was not partial destruction. It was the collapse of entire ground sections, where the earth failed everywhere at once, pulling buildings down to different depths. For Heracleion, just a few minutes of shaking were enough to distort the entire layout of the city, as if a painting had been twisted off its axis by an unseen force. And the earthquakes did not strike only once. Geological studies suggest that between 220 and 250, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a sequence of major tremors linked to shifting along the Hellenic-Anatolian plate boundary. Alexandria and Canopus also suffered damage, but Heracleion, already standing at the edge of structural survival, absorbed the most severe consequences. It wasn't only the walls that moved. The water responded as well. Some canals deepened dramatically in the wake of the tremors. Entire sections of land dropped, allowing river and seawater to rush in. Reconstructed maps show new canal lines cutting across the city, not carved by human hands, but opened by the earth itself. One of the most haunting discoveries is the presence of intact wooden boats, found exactly where they seem to have been abandoned moments earlier. Perhaps during the chaos, residents attempted to rescue cargo or relocate vessels, but the ground sank too quickly, leaving the boats suspended in place. They remain today like frozen moments, snapshots of a day that unraveled faster than anyone could react. With each successive earthquake, Heracleion lost its ability to defend itself. The final efforts to stabilize the city, adding more stone, raising platforms, reinforcing embankments, meant nothing against the accelerating collapse of the ground. The temple of Amun-Khonsu, the spiritual heart of the city, began to tilt visibly. A section of its northern wall sank more than a meter within only a few decades, a nearly unimaginable rate for Egyptian stone architecture. But what made this process irreversible was not the earthquakes alone. It was the way those tremors compounded everything Heracleion had carried for generations. Soft soil, uneven sedimentation, slow erosion, and long-term subsidence. The earthquakes were only the final blow, and when that blow struck the city's weakest point, the city no longer had the strength to stand. And as the ground opened in widening seams, the water, which had always watched from the edges, began to advance. From here, the story shifts from the violence of shaking earth to the steady patience of water, a force that does not destroy in a night, but claims its ground over years, even centuries. It is in this moment that the next chapter begins, the waters rising, not with anger, but with the quiet persistence of an ocean that had waited a very long time. After the earthquakes of the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the Common Era, Heracleion was no longer the city it once had been. Its buildings sat askew, entire districts sank lower than before, and along the horizon of the ancient port, a new force began to advance. Water. Not crashing waves, not storms, but a quiet rise from river and sea alike, inching forward like the long exhale of the ocean touching places it had never reached. Modern oceanographic studies reveal that after the 2nd century, the balance between the Nile's outflow and the Mediterranean's water level began to shift. Perhaps it was regional climate change, perhaps an internal shift within the Nile's branching currents. Whatever the cause, the outcome was the same. Water levels at the mouth of the Canopic branch rose steadily for decades. For a city built entirely on canals, embankments, and soft delta soil, this rise was not just an inconvenience, it was another weight added to ground already exhausted. Marine sediments found inside the courtyard of the Amun Khonsu temple show that between the years 250 and 300, the sacred precinct experienced temporary flooding. This means the protective embankments that once shielded Heracleion's spiritual center had been overtopped. When the water entered, it left silt behind, adding weight onto massive stone structures already leaning from centuries of stress. That extra pressure sped up subsidence, a chain reaction no human effort could stop. The people of Heracleion did not simply watch the water advance. Large stone blocks found along the canals show attempts to reinforce the embankments. Additional side channels were dug in hopes of redirecting the flow. But the water was changing direction too quickly. Human efforts were like placing small stones in the path of a rising tide. As water pushed deeper into the canals, it created swirling eddies during the Nile flood season. These disruptions struck at the city's fragile equilibrium. Areas once stable became unpredictable. Deep channels turned shallow, and shallow ones suddenly opened into sinkholes where the ground had collapsed. These shifts did more than reshape the city. They struck at the heart of Heracleion's economy. Archaeological evidence shows that by the late 3rd century, large seafaring vessels could no longer enter the city's central harbors. That meant trade, the very breath of Heracleion, began to fade from the same waters that once sustained it. And as the lowest districts filled with water, structures already weakened by earthquakes could no longer resist. The soft earth beneath them shifted from slow subsidence to rapid sinking when saturated. Several colossal statues, recovered intact from the mud, show signs they were partially submerged before they disappeared entirely. Layered sediments covering them prove that the city's descent was not a single catastrophic moment, but a sequence of heavy, exhausted breaths taken by land, water, and time itself. What makes Heracleion so haunting is not the image of a great flood swallowing everything in a single day, but the quietness of its decline. A city losing height year by year, decade by decade, like a ship slowly lowering itself toward the sea floor without anyone realizing. To those living then, it may have seemed like nothing more than an odd season of high water. But to us, reading the story in sediments and sunken architecture, we see this moment clearly. The water was stepping into its role as the final judge. It did not destroy Heracleion with fury. It erased the city with infinite patience, and once both water and earth slipped out of balance, Heracleion needed only one more push, another tremor, a sudden shift of the river, a single episode of liquefaction, to lose its last foothold. That moment, when the city began to sink quickly like a door pushed shut by the wind, awaits us in the next part. When archaeologists look through the still layers of mud and sediment resting on the Mediterranean seabed, they reach almost the same conclusion. From the 3rd to the early 4th century after the Common Era, Heracleion crossed an irreversible threshold. This was the moment when long-term subsidence, rising water levels, and repeated earthquakes converged, not as separate events, but as one overwhelming force. What had once moved slowly, like the subtle breathing of earth and water, suddenly shifted into a decisive motion, as if a door that had stood firm for centuries was finally forced shut. Beneath the temple of Amun-Khonsu, excavations revealed something extraordinary. The entire foundation had collapsed almost as a single piece, not shattered, not scattered. Such a phenomenon occurs only when the ground beneath liquefies instantly, losing all strength under immense weight. A stone column weighing several tons, which should have broken into fragments upon falling, was found resting intact on the seafloor, as though pressed gently but irresistibly downward. The collapse was eerily soft, total yet quiet, like a city being lowered into deeper water over the span of hours or days. In the eastern harbor, archaeologists found stretches of stone walls, tens of meters long, all leaning in the same direction, forming a strange, sweeping arc. This indicates that the entire ground layer beneath them had dropped at once, a phenomenon possible only when an earthquake triggers large-scale liquefaction. Sediment patterns suggest this event took place around the mid-3rd century, aligning with the powerful seismic sequence recorded in the eastern Mediterranean around that time. It was not only the stone structures that were pulled downward. Wooden boats slid into the deep in a similarly haunting way. Some vessels were found completely intact, still tied to their mooring posts. This means the residents never managed to move them or unload their cargo. The ground beneath them simply failed. Water rushed in, the soil turned to slurry, and everything was drawn down together. Archaeologists described the scene as a city disappearing through its own floor. The placement of the colossal statues tells the same story. They are not found in chaotic heaps or shattered in violent collapse. Instead, each one lies a short distance from the others, tilted in the precise direction of the sinking ground. The stone faces that once gazed toward the sky now rest in shadowed water, their expressions still calm, as if they witnessed the breaking moment and simply let it happen. As for how the citizens reacted, history is silent. No surviving text describes panic or flight. No record speaks of evacuation. What remains are quiet artifacts of interrupted life. A pot left unfinished on the wheel, goods stored in a warehouse that no one returned to, boats still tethered at the docks. These fragments suggest that the sinking happened faster than people could respond. Perhaps they had only hours, or days, or at most a few short weeks to watch the ground beneath them dissolve. After the first major collapse, the city's remaining stability began to unravel. Areas once used for housing or storage started sinking too, not evenly, but in a chain reaction. Places where the soil was firmer held a little longer. Softer zones gave way almost immediately. The result was a funnel-shaped depression, pulling Heracleion downward toward the sea in a gradual, unmistakable slope. From an archaeological perspective, that moment marks the clearest fracture in the city's history. Heracleion stopped being a thriving port, a ritual center, a maritime gateway. It became something else entirely, a place beginning the long process of vanishing. The break was not an ending, but a turning point, the first step into the chapter of descent. From then on, for decades, entire blocks of buildings, stretches of road, and harbor platforms were buried under layers of mud and marine sand. one after another, slowly but surely, like a long sleep settling over stone. And as the sinking continued, steady as the slow breath of the ocean, Heracleion entered a different state, no longer collapsing, but quietly drifting away from the world it once belonged to. When the first major collapse struck in the 3rd to 4th century after the Common Era, Heracleion did not vanish in an instant. There was no roar, no towering wave swallowing the city whole. Instead, it sank the way dusk slips off the surface of the sea, a slow curve of fading light that thins, softens, and finally dissolves into darkness without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. If the earthquakes were the blow that shook the city loose, then what followed was the quiet journey of a world being slowly carried downward. Archaeological layers show that between roughly 350 and 450, Heracleion went through repeated periods of accelerated sinking. Some districts disappeared over a few decades, others took a century or more. The stone buildings, heavier and more rigid, sank the fastest. Temple walls, stone columns, colossal statues, all pulled into the soft earth under their own weight. Meanwhile, wooden warehouses, market stalls, and pathways were taken by water first, flooding seasonally until they decayed. Smaller objects, coins, pottery, pieces of jewelry, remained exactly where they were last touched, then slipped gently beneath layers of mud, like fragments of memory left unfinished. The walls that once tilted after the earthquakes now dropped meters deeper. Geological models show that the ground subsided 50 to 70 centimeters per century, a rate powerful enough to transform an entire city within a human lifetime. Residential quarters became shallow pools. Bustling docks turned into quiet marshland. The sacred center, the soul of the city, sank beneath waters that rose not by human rhythm, but by the slow, patient pulse of river and sea. Evidence suggests that many residents stayed during the early stages of this sinking. They repaired roofs, built new embankments, moved goods to higher ground, doing everything they could to hold on. But those traces grow fewer, then vanish. As commerce died, as rituals became impossible to perform in flooded courtyards, as familiar canals turned into heavy swaths of mud, people had no reason to remain. They likely left in quiet waves, seeking refuge in Alexandria or Canopus, where the land was still firm. The canals that had once been Heracleion's lifelines soon became basins of trapped silt. Each annual Nile flood carried mud into the sunken city, weighing it down further. Each dry season let the mud settle and harden, pulling Heracleion deeper into the soft earth, a cycle no one could interrupt. There were no collapses, no violent scenes, only slow, even soundless motion, like the long exhale of the land itself. The colossal statues that once stood outside the Amun-Khonsu temple eventually disappeared under layers of silt. Some, nearly 5 meters tall, were found more than 7 meters deep beneath the seafloor, a clear sign that the city's descent stretched across centuries, not a single disaster. They did not break. They did not shatter. They simply drifted into darkness, losing sunlight the way ancient worlds lose their names. As Heracleion settled deeper, salt water from the Mediterranean began to seep in, mixing with the fresh water of the Nile to create a brackish world. And in an unexpected twist, that mixture, neither sea nor river, preserved the city. The low-oxygen environment slowed the decay of wood, Pottery retained its structure. Metal corroded gently rather than violently. While Heracleion vanished from human life, it began to survive in the realm of water. By the 7th to 8th century, Heracleion was erased from maps entirely. No one remembered its exact location. Ancient texts mentioned it only faintly, as if it belonged to another story, another age. Medieval Arab geographers knew the name Thonis only through distant echoes, unaware that the city they mentioned lay asleep beneath 7 meters of water and silt. Its disappearance was not an ending, but a transformation, from a living city to a sleeping one, from a bustling port to a sealed layer of memory resting under the Mediterranean. And in that long sleep, Heracleion kept its shape, waiting for a touch, a movement of light, the moment someone would rediscover it. From this point onward, Heracleion entered the most mysterious phase of its existence, absent from maps, fading from human memory, surviving only as a drifting name in old manuscripts, suspended somewhere between history and myth. When Heracleion finally vanished beneath the water in the 7th to 8th century after the Common Era, the strangest part was not its collapse, but the silence that followed. No chronicle mourned it. No storyteller tried to hold on to it. No scribe recorded the final moment when the city slipped into mud and water. A place that had once controlled every international ship entering Egypt, once served as the ceremonial center of Amun, once acted as the seaward doorway for the ancient world, disappeared from human memory more easily than almost any major city of antiquity. Part of the reason lay in the land itself. The Nile Delta never stayed still. When the Canopic branch silted up and shifted course, the old maritime route lost its relevance. Merchants adjusted, steering eastward toward Canopus and Alexandria, the new gates to Egypt. Priestly rituals migrated inland. And the residents, people who had lived for generations along Heracleion's waterfront, simply moved to firmer ground. As the people departed, the memories departed with them. The city fell off the map long before it fell out of sight. The surviving references from Greco-Roman writers, Herodotus, Diodorus, mention Heracleion only in passing, as a waypoint on the maritime route, nothing more. They could not have imagined that centuries later, the entire city would be buried beneath the sea. By the time Arab geographers like al-Masudi began writing, every trace was gone. All they inherited were scattered tales of a town the sea swallowed, or a place that once stood near the river's mouth but can no longer be found. The name Heracleion, or Thonis, became a fragment of memory, too faint to be history, too persistent to become myth. No one knew where it lay. No one knew why it had vanished. Some medieval scholars believed it was just a scribal error. Others thought it was a city renamed over time. Every theory fell into silence because the truth was buried too deep beneath marine silt for anyone of that era to reach. As nautical maps from Arab, Venetian, and Genoese sailors grew more accurate between the 10th and 13th centuries, the waters off Alexandria appeared only as shifting shallows and wandering sandbars. Nothing hinted that beneath those quiet waves was a city that once stood in the sunlight. Heracleion had been forgotten for so long that no one even remembered to wonder, and that silence stretched for more than 1,000 years. No medieval expedition, no Ottoman cartographer, not even the scholars of the French occupation attempted to search for it. No one imagined that beyond the Alexandrian coastline lay anything more than sand, water, and the fading memory of old shipping routes. Humanity saw only the surface of the sea, never the history resting beneath it, and within that forgetting, a strangely beautiful paradox formed. Because it was forgotten, Heracleion was preserved. No one dug into it. No one built over it. No one destroyed it. The sea held the city in perfect quiet, a natural museum no one knew existed. Heracleion no longer belonged to maps, but it belonged to something deeper, the memory of water. And water kept everything. Every stone slab, every seal, every statue, every abandoned boat caught in its final moment of chaos. From here, the story ascends to another threshold, leaving behind human forgetfulness and stepping into the silent guardianship of the sea. And from that silence, Heracleion enters the next chapter of its long journey. After Heracleion vanished from maps and human memory in the 7th to 8th century after the Common Era, the city entered an entirely different mode of existence, neither life nor ruin, but a state of absolute sleep. For nearly 2,000 years, it lay beneath more than 7 meters of seabed silt, a place where light could not descend, where motion slowed until it was almost still. In that soundless world, Heracleion was not destroyed. It was preserved. The sediment layers tell the story with the calm precision of time itself. Each flood season of the Nile deposited a new sheet of silt, thicker, heavier, layering over the old, like darkened pages of a book no one was reading. The ancient delta continued its eternal cycle of building upward and sinking downward. And in the oxygen-poor depths of the sea, things that should have vanished long ago endured. Wood resisted decay, ceramics held their color, metal avoided deep corrosion. Nature, the force that once pulled the city under, had now become its perfect guardian. Even the wooden boats, the most fragile of materials, survived in astonishing condition. Many lay more than 6 meters deep, with wooden joints still visible, plant fiber ropes intact, and the subtle fingerprints of ancient Egyptian shipbuilding preserved in every plank. They endured not through miracle, but through isolation, sealed off in a chamber of stillness, maintained by the sea for more than 1,200 years. The colossal stone statues rested just as peacefully. Royal and divine figures carved from Aswan red granite, weighing tens of tons, were found lying neatly beneath layers of sediment, undamaged and undisturbed. Such preservation was possible only because liquefaction had lowered them gently before the seabed settled above, covering them like a heavy blanket that fixed them in place for 2 millennia. Even the smallest objects, gold rings, ceramic vessels, merchant seals, remained in perfect order. Some lay grouped together exactly as if the last person to touch them had simply set them down and walked away. This reveals how still the water once was, too soft to scatter the city's memories. The sea, in its own quiet language, seemed to place a hand over Heracleion and whisper, "Sleep here." Geological evidence shows that the city did not sink through a single catastrophe, but through hundreds of soft, natural gestures. Subsidence, rising sea levels, shifting canals, sediment accumulating year after year. Together, they formed a long, gentle disappearance. Generations living near Alexandria throughout the medieval and Ottoman eras never knew that a complete city was resting beneath the shallow waters at their feet. For centuries, the sea continued to shield Heracleion. Sand covered the structures like a cushion, slowing erosion. Algae rarely grew, granite resisted, and light could not reach deep enough. Salt water, paradoxically, protected many artifacts better than fresh water would have. Nowhere else in Egypt did nature create such a perfect capsule for preservation. Before underwater archaeology existed, humanity could only guess that something ancient might lie offshore. But no one knew where, or how deep, or from what age. Every question dissolved into the blue darkness, held back by the water. Thus, Heracleion became a silent form of memory, a story drifting through time without words, not told, yet not lost. Like a legend no longer spoken aloud, but still intact in its quiet essence. And then, in the 20th century, magnetic surveys, sonar imaging, and the birth of underwater archaeology opened a door that had never existed before. For the first time, humans could peer through the sediment into a world only the sea had known for 2,000 years. This was the moment when the story prepared to shift once again. Heracleion was about to be awakened, and from faint magnetic signals, from stones hidden in mud, from subtle ripples across the seafloor, a decades-long search began to take shape. Each clue carried a strange intuition that the city believed lost forever was still there, whole, waiting in its deep sleep to be touched by light once more. For nearly 2,000 years, Heracleion lay in absolute darkness beneath the Mediterranean, kept by mud, water, and perfect silence, yet completely erased from human memory. Only in the second half of the 20th century, when underwater archaeology began opening doors that had never existed before, did the first hints of a sunken city begin to surface. Faint and flickering like distant lights, lost in murky, sediment-heavy water. No one imagined that beneath those calm waves rested a once thriving metropolis, waiting quietly to be called by its name again. The early explorations of the 1960s and 1970s were focused on finding the sunken palace of the Ptolemies off the coast of Alexandria, where Cleopatra and Mark Antony once lived. When divers found massive stone blocks and scattered columns, they assumed they had discovered remnants of that palace, destroyed by ancient earthquakes. Heracleion was not on anyone's mind. When the name appeared at all, it was only as a vague footnote in old texts, with no fixed location. The deeper past remained silent. By the 1980s, sonar and magnetic surveying entered the toolkit. Several research teams detected strange magnetic anomalies northeast of Alexandria, regular, aligned patterns that did not match natural geology. But the technology was still too young to interpret with confidence. Reports remained cautious, possibly man-made structures, potential submerged artifacts. Many scholars dismissed the anomalies as sedimentary formations or earthquake debris. Yet one detail persisted, impossible to ignore. Greco-Roman maps consistently placed Thonis, Heracleion somewhere in this region, though its position shifted from map to map. Some 2nd century before the Common Era charts placed it at the mouth of the Canopic branch. Others slid it several kilometers west. The inconsistency turned the search into a strange game. The map changed each time someone looked at it, while the city itself waited unchanged beneath the sea. Then, in the late 1990s, a new name entered the story and transformed the entire quest: Frank Gaudio. Unlike others, he was not captivated by Cleopatra's palace. He was haunted by a single question: If Heracleion once existed, how could it vanish so completely? No war, no fire, no migration recorded. Only silence. Gaudio believed that silence was an invitation to look deeper into the layers of seabed where history had been folded away. He equipped his search with the most advanced technology of the time: high-sensitivity magnetometers, side-scan sonar, and three-dimensional seafloor mapping, tools earlier expeditions had only brushed against. And then, in 1999, his team detected massive, powerful magnetic signatures stretching for hundreds of meters, patterns unmistakably aligned like granite or sandstone architecture. Straight lines, rectangles, parallel axes. A city was beginning to reveal itself beneath the water. But it still had no name until a single moment changed everything. A large stone stela was lifted from the green-blue depths, its inscriptions preserved with impossible clarity. It did not speak of the Ptolemies. It did not mention Cleopatra. It bore the decree of King Nectanebo I, dated to 380 before the Common Era, referring directly to customs regulations at Heracleion. When those letters were read aloud, the city ceased being a mystery. It returned as truth, as if calling out through 2,000 years of darkness. That discovery opened the door to a new chapter, one where history, ocean, and human curiosity finally converged. In the year 2000, Heracleion was found. And from that moment on, the light of divers would begin uncovering the miracle sleeping beneath 7 meters of sea silt. Soon would come the moment when human light first touched the murky seafloor, brushing aside thin layers of mud to illuminate the faces of colossal statues that had slept for 2 millennia. The moment when Heracleion, after breathing only in darkness for so long, showed its first signs of awakening. In the year 2000, after many years of quiet surveying, the signals rising from the seafloor off Alexandria finally guided Frank Gaudio to a stretch of water that modern maps left blank, but ancient texts had once whispered about. On the magnetic scan, faint streaks of light appeared like weak signals from memories trying to find their way home. No one in the archaeological team realized they were standing at the threshold of one of the greatest underwater discoveries of the century. But the sea knew. It had waited long enough. On an early summer dive, sunlight scattered across the surface in broken strands, like fragments of a story long forgotten. As the divers descended to nearly 7 meters, the water thickened with silt, shrinking visibility to only a few dozen centimeters. Yet through that underwater haze, massive stone blocks began to emerge, flat, broad, covered in fine sand, like the surface of a tail buried far too long. A diver brushed away the first layer of mud, and carved lines appeared, sharp, clean, impossibly fresh. It was a pink granite stela nearly 2 meters tall. When it was lifted to the surface and met daylight for the first time in 2,000 years, the inscription became unmistakably clear. Nectanebo issues a decree at Heracleion. In that instant, all uncertainty dissolved. No more theories, no more speculation. Heracleion had been found. The dives that followed opened a stream of wonders. A 5-meter statue of a king appeared under the dive lights, its face full and smooth, its jawline and nose crisp as if newly carved. A statue of a queen wearing a lotus crown lay tilted in the sand, a veil of silt draped across her like a ceremonial covering. A massive relief, large as a temple gate, rested upside down, yet completely unbroken. All of it had sunk with the soft grace of liquefied earth, not the violence of destruction. What struck the team most was the absolute stillness, an otherworldly quiet that did not belong to the surface. Light swept across the stone faces, giving them the illusion of breath, while the thin layer of mud clinging to them resembled a blanket of time. Heracleion did not look like a ruined city. It looked like a city asleep, waiting to be awakened. But the greatest astonishment came not from the statues, but from the way an entire city slowly revealed itself. The foundations of the Amun-Konsu temple, intersecting canals, ancient harbors, warehouses, stone streets, ritual objects, gold rings, ceramic vessels, lead ceilings. Everything lay exactly where it had been, as if time had frozen at the very moment the city slipped beneath the sea. When the first three-dimensional map was built, Heracleion did not appear as a cluster of ruins. It appeared as a complete city. Roads were still recognizable, temple steps still aligned exactly where they once rose above water. The canals traced the same paths they had when boats glided through them, now dry arteries of a body that once lived. Frank Gaudio described that moment as the sea returning memory to humankind. From that moment forward, the sea no longer held Heracleion alone. Excavation began. Mud lifted away, stones measured, structures reconnected. A name that once drifted like a faint shadow in ancient texts now rose into the light of the modern world. And so the journey opened. Heracleion emerged, layer by layer from the seafloor, like an ancient spirit slowly opening its eyes after a 2,000-year sleep, revealing the first contours of a world that once shone brightly upon the water. After the moment the stela of Nectanebo I was lifted out of the water in the year 2000, the excavation of Heracleion entered a new chapter. It was no longer a search wrapped in uncertainty, but a rare meeting between the present and a world that had been sleeping on the seafloor for 2,000 years. Every layer of mud brushed away felt like a warm breath awakening an ancient memory. And the deeper the excavation went, the clearer it became that the sea had not simply swallowed Heracleion, it had preserved it. From the year 2000 to 2005, Frank Gaudio's team expanded the survey area meter by meter. What emerged was not a scattering of ruined structures, but the contours of a complete city. Temple walls, house foundations, harbor wharves, embankments, wooden reinforcement stakes, and traces of canals. Everything remained in its proper order, as if the city had only just slipped underwater, and time had frozen right afterward. Among the discoveries that astonished the world most were the colossal statues. When divers raised them, the carved lines of the red granite appeared clearly, the bridge of the nose, the curve of the cheek, the deep-set eyes. Some statues stood over 5 meters tall and weighed tens of tons, yet they remained intact, as if untouched by 2 millennia beneath the sea. Each one opened a doorway back into the world of ritual. Kings standing before Amun, queens wearing lotus crowns, sacred animals of ancient ceremonies. What amazed archaeologists even more was that the statues were not scattered randomly. They lay in rows, aligned on axes, following the arrangement of a complete ceremonial space. At once, archaeologists recognized what had happened. The statues had sunk all at once when the ground beneath them liquefied, and the seabed's gentle layers covered them without shifting their positions. It was the rarest gift archaeology can receive. A sacred landscape preserved exactly as it once was, only now beneath the waves. Alongside the statues were hundreds of smaller artifacts that appeared almost untouched. Lead ceilings used for cargo, Greek and Egyptian coins found together in a torn pouch, Rhodian amphorae, bronze ritual objects left at the edge of the temple. Each piece offered a glimpse into a city that had lived at the crossroads of international trade and sacred ceremony, a place sustained by both the sea and the divine. The ancient boats told another chapter of the story. Many were preserved with their wooden joinery and plant fiber ropes still in place, built without metal nails. Classic Egyptian shipbuilding. Some boats lay directly beside the harbor, as though their owners had stepped away on an ordinary day, unaware that the ground beneath them was preparing to sink. Together, these discoveries made one truth unmistakably clear. Heracleion did not fall to human hands. It was not looted, burned, or destroyed by war. It was taken by nature, slowly, steadily, through a series of changes no ancient community could resist. What made the discovery extraordinary was how well the city's sacred architecture had survived. Archaeologists could trace every part of the ritual landscape: statue bases, incense pits, and blue-painted temple walls, meant to mimic sunlight shimmering through water. When the map of Heracleion was rebuilt, the feeling was not just amazement, it was something more emotional. The city did not lie underwater like a ruin. It rested there like a living body caught between two worlds, one half belonging to the past, the other newly returned to the present. And in that moment, larger questions began to rise. Why did the temple of Amun-Khonsu and its sacred structures sink so perfectly intact? What protected them so completely? From this point on, the story leads us into the deepest heart of Heracleion, into the sanctuary of Amun-Khonsu, where the city once held the spiritual pulse of all northern Egypt, and where its most enduring secrets still wait. Among all the structures discovered beneath the Mediterranean, the Temple of Amun-Khonsu is the one that made archaeologists pause the longest. Not only because of its scale, but because of the way it descended into the sea, intact, aligned, as if the ground beneath it suddenly turned to water and allowed the entire building to glide downward without breaking. This phenomenon is almost unheard of in Egyptian archaeology, and it is precisely this strangeness that makes the temple the centerpiece of every question surrounding Heracleion's disappearance. When Frank Goddio and his team mapped the site in the early years of the 21st century, they found that the temple's foundation was built from immense granite blocks arranged in a perfect rectangle. The astonishing detail was not their size, but their placement. Most of the stones still rested at their original coordinates, only several meters lower. It was as though the entire building had lowered itself vertically, instead of collapsing the way any stone structure normally would when its foundation failed. Sediment analysis beneath the temple revealed the cause. The young delta soil had undergone liquefaction during one of the earthquakes of the 2nd to 3rd century after the Common Era. Layers of earth that were already soft turned into a thick liquid, losing their ability to hold weight for a few minutes. In that brief window, the temple sank without tearing itself apart. Stones did not crack. Columns did not topple. Walls did not explode outward. Everything descended as though tugged straight down by gravity, in a motion so gentle it felt eerie. But the mystery of Heracleion lies not only in the moment the temple sank. it lies in how it once lived. Artifacts found around the structure show that the temple had been the heart of an elaborate ritual, the procession of Amun's sacred bark. Small reliefs, bronze heads of deities, gold offerings, and ceremonial objects reveal that this ritual may have been far grander than recorded history suggests. The Amun temple at Heracleion was a holy stop in the god's symbolic journey down to the north during festivals tied to the annual flood. Around the temple, archaeologists uncovered fragments of ceremonial boats, small, exquisitely crafted vessels used to carry the statue of the god. The wood still held the deep red tone of ancient Egyptian timber, preserved by the airless underwater environment. These remnants tell a quiet yet painful truth. When the ground collapsed, the ritual boats were still in place. The ceremony did not end because of war or human abandonment, but because of a natural force that no one could have prepared for. Another deeply intriguing feature is the trace of a wooden support grid beneath the stone foundation, a kind of ancient engineering carpet meant to spread the temple's weight across the unstable delta soil. This proves that the ancient Egyptians understood the fragility of the land. They tried to resist it with sophisticated craftsmanship. But when powerful earthquakes struck one after another, even their ingenuity could not keep the temple anchored to the earth. Seen as a whole, the structure reveals that the temple of Amun-Khonsu was not merely a place of worship. It was the spiritual heart of Heracleion. It was where residents believed the gods listened, where merchants offered prayers before setting sail, where pharaohs affirmed their authority through the presence of Amun at Egypt's shifting northern gateway. So when the temple sank, it was not only a geological event, it was the quiet fading of the city's spiritual heartbeat. Today, the temple rests in the stillness of the sea. Gatekeeper statues lean with the new slope of the seabed. Reliefs lie dim beneath layers of sand. Offering platforms no longer meet the sun. Yet this very stillness makes the temple the most complete vessel of what Heracleion once was, a city of ceremony, of the sea, and of faith in invisible forces. To understand Heracleion fully, we must now step away from its sacred structures and move into the everyday lives of those who lived around the temple, along the harbor, and beside the canals. And that path leads us into the next part of the story, daily life in Heracleion, where the sea was not merely a trade route, but the breath of the entire community. When we look at the statues lying motionless in the darkness beneath the Mediterranean, it is easy to forget that Heracleion was once a living city, in every sense of the word. It once had the shouts of merchants along the harbor, the scent of grain unloaded from ships arriving from the Aegean, the ring of shipbuilders' hammers echoing along the canals, and the cool, damp air drifting through the streets at dawn before sunlight touched the greenish silt of the delta. No one alive can describe that world, but archaeology has gathered enough fragments to rebuild the rhythm of Heracleion when it still stood above the water. Traces of a canal-side marketplace are revealed through small bronze scales, animal-shaped weights, and wooden tax tokens, now softened by centuries underwater. This market sold far more than Egyptian goods. It was a crossroads for Mediterranean commodities: olive oil from Rhodes, wine from Miletus, fine ceramics from Corinth, purple-dyed cloth from Phoenicia. The people of Heracleion lived in a current of cultures, where every item carried a scent, a color, a story from another corner of the world. Near the market stood stone warehouses, where amphorae were sorted before beginning their journey inland. Lead shipping tags found nearby show that Heracleion's customs system ran with remarkable precision. Each seal marked a transaction, a shipment approved, a vessel cleared to continue upriver. Nowhere else in the delta has revealed such a concentration of commercial sealings. Along the harbor, archaeologists uncovered evidence of shipyards, places where lengths of timber were joined with plant fiber ropes in traditional Egyptian fashion. Several 8-meter boats lay side by side beneath layers of silt, showing that shipbuilding had once been the heartbeat of the city. With canals weaving through Heracleion like veins, boats were not just transportation, they were an extension of the home itself. Heracleion lived through its boats, the way Egypt lived through the Nile. Inside the city, daily life appears through the smallest of objects: scorched ceramic bowls, copper fish-cutting knives, a fossilized piece of bread, loom weights cracked by water. Tiny amulets shaped like the dwarf god Bes were found in homes, showing that children once played here, and families hung charms to protect them. It was these everyday people, potters, sailors, porters, boatmen, who formed the soul of Heracleion. Sometimes the smallest details are the most touching. One diver found a little bronze cat amulet, a child's protection charm. When the city began to sink, that family may have fled, carrying memories, but leaving the tiny amulet behind in a house slowly filling with water. 2,000 years later, it rested quietly in the mud, like a long, soft exhale from the past, a reminder that Heracleion was a living place before it became a sleeping one. Together, these details form a portrait of a hybrid city, half Egyptian, half Mediterranean. It carried the traditions of the Nile while echoing the accents of Greek harbors. It was a meeting point of trade, customs, religion, language, a crossroads few other cities in ancient Egypt could match. And from this pulse of daily life, in the next part, we will widen our view beyond Heracleion's canals and docks to see the larger picture. This city was not just part of Egypt, but a crucial node in the vast commercial network of the ancient Mediterranean. Walking along the narrow canals of Heracleion, past wooden houses leaning gently against the soft riverbank and the soft thud of boats brushing the mooring posts, it is easy to forget that this city was far more than a riverside community. At its height, from the 6th to the 4th century before Common Era, Heracleion was a strategic knot in the web of Mediterranean trade. It was not a destination. It was an intersection, a meeting place where the currents of Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, Libya, and even the Red Sea converged like waves gathering before flowing into the heart of Egypt. Heracleion's location was not simply convenient, it was essential. Every ship entering the canopic branch of the Nile, the fastest route into Egypt's wealthy interior, had to stop here first. That made Heracleion the first doorway through which Greek merchants touched Egyptian soil, a land they viewed as the granary of the Mediterranean. Olive oil and wine traveled down from the Aegean, while papyrus, linen, and wheat moved upward from the Nile, a cycle as steady as the breath of the sea itself. Naucratis, the first officially recognized Greek city within Egypt, depended entirely on Heracleion. Any merchant heading to Naucratis had to register here, pay duties here, and receive travel authorization here. That made Heracleion a rare cultural threshold between Greece and Egypt, a place of negotiation and exchange, at once cautious and welcoming. Coins from Athens, Aegina, and Rhodes, found in the seabed today, remain as tiny memories of those long-ago encounters. But Heracleion did not face only northward. It opened eastward toward Phoenicia, the land of purple dye and cedar wood. Fragments of purple textiles, fine jewelry, and fragrant resins discovered in the city reveal that Phoenician traders once favored Heracleion as a stopping point. From the west came goods from Libya. From the south, trade routes through the Red Sea brought spices, gemstones, and exotic animals into the delta. All of these routes converged here, forming a network as wide as the Mediterranean horizon. And from the far western edge of the Mediterranean, another powerful presence left its mark on Heracleion: Carthage. The Carthaginians, masters of the sea and descendants of Phoenician navigators, brought not only goods, but advanced maritime knowledge. Punic amphorae, small resin jars, and merchant symbols engraved on lead seals show that Carthage used Heracleion as a discreet exchange hub before pushing deeper into Egypt. Historians believe Carthage traded luxury items here: silver from Iberia, tin from the Atlantic, and even Libyan mercenaries, which Egypt sometimes needed. Through this quiet channel, Heracleion became an unseen bridge between Egypt and one of the most powerful seafaring states of the ancient world. The Nectaneboi stele, carved in the year 380 before Common Era, confirms Heracleion's central role. It was here that the pharaoh placed his authority over international trade. Greeks, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, all foreigners, were required to pass through Heracleion before entering inland Egypt. The city was both a seaport and a political buffer, the place where Egypt maintained control in an increasingly Hellenized Mediterranean. Even when Alexandria rose like a new beacon of the ancient world, Heracleion did not fade. It became a supporting hub, a marker for navigation, a guiding point for sailors, an extension of Alexandria reaching into the open sea. Greek maritime charts from the Ptolemaic era still listed Heracleion as a landmark to identify before approaching Alexandria. The city did not lose its role. It was simply pushed downward by nature when its fragile ground reached its final limit. Seen in full, Heracleion was never just an Egyptian city. It was the crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean, where Greeks, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Libyans, and Egyptians all met. A place where goods were exchanged, but so were customs, languages, beliefs, and ways of seeing the world. A place where ideas traveled like waves, soft, quiet, yet enduring. And because it rested at this intersection, where currents of civilizations touched, Heracleion carried a special fragility. Points of connection are always the most vulnerable, the most beautiful, the most prosperous, the most alive, and also the easiest to lose. When the city sank, it was not only a geological collapse, it was a reminder of the limits faced by places that stand between worlds. From that understanding, the story naturally flows toward the next chapter, where Heracleion leaves behind lessons for our present, about fragility, adaptation, and the boundaries humanity must always negotiate with nature. When we look at the reconstructed map of Heracleion, pieced together from thousands of artifacts lifted from the seafloor, we are not just looking at the remains of an ancient city. We are looking into a mirror polished by 2,000 years of silence, reflecting something back at every civilization that dares to peer into it. Heracleion once thrived because of the sea and the river, and within that very brilliance, it carried a quiet fragility that no one recognized until it was far too late. The first lesson lies in its location, both Heracleion's greatest gift and its quiet sentence. The city lived because of the Nile's rich silt, because of the channels that tied Egypt to the Mediterranean, because of the winds that brought traders from Greece, Phoenicia, and Libya. But that same silt softened its foundation. That same river mouth shifted its course. And that same sea eventually became the force that pulled Heracleion down. The city shows us that prosperity always casts a long shadow, a shadow of instability we only understand when the light begins to fade. The second lesson comes from the rhythm of its collapse. No great battle erased Heracleion. No fire consumed it. Its disappearance unfolded like a long, slowing breath. A few centimeters of sinking each year, a gentle tremor every century, a handful of high-water seasons that forced families to move their homes. A great city can vanish not because of a single catastrophe, but because of countless small changes piling up across generations. And that leads to a quiet question for us today. Are our modern cities taller, wider, louder, standing on the same slow shifts, simply waiting for us to notice? The third lesson lies in the way the sea preserves memory. For more than 1,200 years, no one spoke of Heracleion except in faint mentions within ancient texts. It vanished almost completely from human memory. Yet beneath the water, the city survived almost intact. Boats lying sideways on soft mud, stone statues still holding their expressions, ceramic bowls with burn marks, lead seals with their tax numbers unbroken. This tells us something simple but profound. Forgetting does not always mean losing. Some things that seem gone are only resting, waiting for a light, a hand, a moment to return. Another lesson emerges from Heracleion's nature as a crossroads. It was not fully Egyptian and not fully Greek. It was a meeting place of many worlds. Phoenician merchants carrying their royal purple dye, Libyan sailors bringing stories from the desert, Greeks carrying their writing, their coins, their gods. This openness made Heracleion prosperous, but it also meant that when it fell, the shock traveled far, like a broken junction shaking every road connected to it. And then there is a quieter, deeper lesson, one as soft as the water itself. The silence of the past does not mean the past has nothing more to say. Once Heracleion was rediscovered, it told us more than any ancient manuscript ever recorded. Stories of shifting ground, of Mediterranean trade routes, of Amun's rituals during the flood season, of daily life along the harbor, of the fragility of every system humans believe to be permanent. Our cities today may be built differently, on different scales, but they still face the same boundaries: water, earth, and time. Heracleion is not a dark warning. It is a gentle reminder. Every city, no matter how great, must listen to the ground it stands on. Because the ground remembers. The water has its own rhythm, and history always returns, speaking in the softest sounds. And when these lessons finally settle, all that remains is one final stretch. A moment to look back over the entire journey, from light to shadow, from prosperity to a long sleep beneath the sea, and understand why a lost city can still whisper so much to those living in the present. When our journey reaches its final shore, Heracleion no longer appears as a lost city, but as a living presence breathing in another world. It did not collapse with the roar of war or the blaze of catastrophe. It simply released itself quietly, like a long exhale after centuries of trying to stand firm against the subtle but persistent movements of earth and water, and then settled at the floor of the Mediterranean, where time drifts as slowly as a tide, dissolving into the dark. Throughout this journey, what we've uncovered is not just stone statues, temple columns, or boats resting in silt. What we've uncovered is a rhythm, a full arc that begins in light and prosperity, moves through delicate tremors, slips into silent disappearance, and finally rises again under the modern glow of the 21st century. That rhythm, though born in ancient Egypt, echoes the path of any civilization that has ever stood along the coastline of history. Heracleion was once a beacon of the Mediterranean, the gateway into Egypt, where merchants from Greece, Phoenicia, and Libya crossed paths, where pharaohs projected their authority to the outside world, where the sacred boat of Amun reached the sea from the upper river. A city like that never fully disappears. It only shifts its form. From a living port, it became a memory resting beneath the water, waiting for someone to find it again. Perhaps the deepest thing Heracleion leaves behind lies in its silence. No one recorded its final day. No story captures the moment its people walked away. Even its name split into Heracleion and Thonis, as if the letters themselves drifted with the currents. And yet, silence can be the strongest keeper of all, untouched, unlayered, unaltered by human memory. When the first divers touched the statues lying in the mud, they weren't just touching stone. They were touching a moment frozen for nearly 2,000 years, a moment where time paused long enough for the past and present to meet. Few cities in history have been granted that privilege, to remain whole, sealed off from upheaval, like an ancient frame holding the final image of itself. Today, as Heracleion rises again through sonar scans and three-dimensional reconstructions, we see more than an underwater settlement. We see human memory resurfacing, layer by layer, like echoes from a distant age. Every artifact brushed clean of silt is a heartbeat of the past returning. Every statue lifted into sunlight is a breath from another world rising to the surface. But the last lesson Heracleion leaves us is a quiet one, yet deep. Every civilization, no matter how radiant, still depends on the ground beneath its feet. And that ground, whether it is delta mud or continental stone, speaks its own language. When people listen, they live in harmony. When they forget, nature responds in movements no one can stop. And now, if you close your eyes, you might see the statues the divers once illuminated, leaning gently, veiled in moss, yet still intact, like the old breath of time. You might hear shards of pottery brushing softly as currents pass by. You might sense the stone steps disappearing into darkness. All of it is still sleeping, not in an ending, but in a continuation. Heracleion has not left the world. It has simply chosen a quieter way to remain. Historical storytell, where cities never truly vanish, but drift beneath the waters of time, waiting to be told once more.